The original Dick Van Dyke Show was originally a pilot done by Carl Reiner, and he was the star.
I said, well, I'm a husband, a father. I live in New Rochelle. I'm an actor, a writer. I work in television. I'll write about that.
He had written the pilot. He sat at Fire Island. He prepared 13 scripts for a new series to be called Head of the Household.
We did the pilot, a pretty good pilot. We did it in New York. We're going to stay in New York. It didn't sell, and I said, that's it.
I wondered why it hadn't sold, and I asked if I could see it, and I saw it. He got me a print, and I saw it. And it seemed apparent to me the reason it hadn't sold is because he was miscast.
They didn't like Carl playing himself. He was writing about himself, basically from his days on the Sid Caesar Show.
So I said, okay, I'll be the producer and the head writer. And so he suggested Dick Van Dyke.
I guess they had shot the pilot with Carl Reiner. Carl had written the show for himself. And I think it was Sheldon who saw me first and said, you should go see this guy.
The material was so good, the written material was so great that I said, it shouldn't be wasted. Do you mind if I try it again, recast it and try it again? He said, that's fine.
And they gave me a week off from Bye Bye Birdie, which I had coming. And I flew out here and did the pilot.
His willingness to step aside and let somebody else carry the ball was the reason for the existence of the Van Dyke Show.
Mary Tyler Moore had auditioned to be Danny Thomas' daughter. And Danny had said with that nose, she could not possibly be my daughter.
A year later, when he was now looking for someone to play Dick Van Dyke's wife, he remembered.
And I told Danny about the problems we were having in auditioning people, and he said, how about that girl with 3 names?
I was terrified because it was not only Danny Thomas and Sheldon Leonard and Dick Van Dyke, but it was my hero, Carl Reiner, who was the writer-producer of this show.
She read about 3 lines, the opening lines, which had no drama to them, no meat in them, just hello, darling, or I'm here. And I heard something in her voice that thrilled me. And I grabbed the top of her head.
And said, come with me, with a maniacal look in his eyes. And he, sort of like a rudder, directed me down the hallway.
And I took her into Sheldon's office, who had told me, I'll know her when I see her. I said, I think I saw her, Sheldon, this is it. And he agreed immediately.
I was 22, I don't remember what year it was, but I'd lied about my age and made it 23 because I was afraid that people would think I was too young for Dick Van Dyke, who is 10 years older than I am.
We became a brother and sister, and Carl became our uncle. That's the way we always said it.
I never saw him make a bad choice in anything. He never went the wrong way to do something.
Whatever we wrote, we said, we can't wait to see what he does with this, because he's going to make it better.
We needed that kind of a receding kind of guy, shy kind of guy, and Dick is that.
And he was so good looking. There was just right away a sense of being very happy, very safe in the talent that he shared with me.
I have never known a man who was more adept at props than Dick, and he could do anything I asked.
Dick was absolutely wonderful. I've never seen Dick angry. I've never heard him say, no, I won't do that. He used to say, is that funny? Is that funny enough? Is that funny?
He couldn't do accents. We never gave him anything where he had to do an accent. He comes from Danville, Illinois. They don't know. In that part of the country, they don't know how to do accents.
Sheldon Leonard said, I know who's going to play Sally Rogers. The only one girl that played out is Rosemary. There was no argument there.
So I get a call one day, and they said, go to Desilu, and Danny Thomas' office says, oh, I'm going to do the show. She said, no. She said, this is for the new show, Dick Van Dyke. I said, what's a Dick Van Dyke?
She brought in her really good friend, Morey, Amsterdam.
So they called him, and I called him, and I said, they're going to call you about a new show called the Dick Van Dyke Show. And he said, what's a Dick Van Dyke? I said, I don't know, but we'll find out.
You get Morey Amsterdam, you get 1 billion jokes. And we're in the process of making jokes in that writer's room. So if we're ever stuck for a one-liner, he's got it.
I think I learned an awful lot about timing from the both of them. They were that way in daily conversation. I mean, that's who Rosemary was, and that's who Morey was. They were those persons. She
never took a false step. She never fumbled a line. She never. When we had rehearsals, and on the air, everybody fumbled. I don't remember Rosie ever blowing a line.
Procter & Gamble canceled it at the end of its first year.
It had pretty bad ratings that first season. I forget what night we were on, but it was not a good night, and we were opposite something pretty strong.
I said, let's rerun it in the summer. They said, but they don't pay any money. They'll pay $6,000 a show. I said, give it to them for nothing.
And without Perry Como as a competition, we began to grow an audience. People kind of discovered this during the summer, and by the next fall, we hit the air with pretty good ratings.
And we were on for 5 years, very successfully.
In television, your principal responsibility is to keep those scripts coming. Keep those good, solid, playable scripts coming.
As the producer, head writer of the show, I wrote 40 of the first 60 shows myself.
I remember times he would come into my room, just wander in, and he would say, so what's new in your life? What's going on? And I knew at that point he was stuck. He was looking for something, you know.
He was several scripts ahead. He had 8, and then he just kept writing.
We'd have story meetings with Persky and Denoff and Belson and Marshall and Sheldon and myself and come up with, you know, what we call springboards, and then they would send in a one-page outline, 3 scenes, and then we'd go home and do it. And when those guys wrote it, I didn't have to work hard.
I developed a procedure of reading not one script at the beginning of the week's work, but 2 scripts.
And you would read a script that would not be produced until the following week. And then you would read the second script, which had had that treatment the prior week. And the second script was the script of this week.
Carl would have a script, but then everyone was allowed to put in their 2 cents worth. You know, Morey was allowed to come up with his own one-liners, and Rosie. The input was always great, and it was great teamwork.
The first hour or so was not about what we were working on. It was about what was happening at home.
Anything that happened in somebody's life, you know, down it would go. And so many of the episodes were based on actual events in somebody's life.
I think Carl Reiner was the first one to say, you don't need to think of anything. Just tell me about your life. And we would sit around literally telling Carl the most embarrassing moments in our entire life.
There was a lot of autobiographical stuff in it. I mean, the marriage while I was in the Army, there was a thing we did on our honeymoon that was based on my honeymoon when I was remanded at the quarters.
And then once you tap from your own life, then it's easy to learn to steal other people's lives.
Rob Reiner, Carl's son, had been attacked by a woodpecker in the neighborhood. He was plucking hair out of his head for a nest, so we used that. He tried to take from his own life. I think that's what made the show so great. You know, he was basically taking from his own life and writing about what he knew.
Start with the truth, stay human, don't reach for ugly, be vulnerable. I think that those are the things that the show was built on.
The big objection was the pants that I wore in the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Mary set a standard for how women dressed by wearing those slacks.
Oh, they said something about the fact that, I forget the term they used, that they should not permit the pants to cup her buttocks or something.
He said there was a star of this show, and he wanted him to be invisible, you know, never there. Then we heard his voice on the phone a few times. Then he said, well, we'll just show the back of his head.
In the second year, the Al and Brady became very important because we had a lot of shows that had a lot of fun in them. We didn't want the back of his head to show when he can give you a look, you know. So we turned him around.
And there was all kinds of wonderful stuff to do with the toupee and the chorus line of toupees that he owned that were sometimes seen lined up in a row in back of him.
He would come to every run-through and every reading, and he would watch it.
He had an uncanny ability to point out what was wrong with the spine of a show or something, you know. And he would say, why don't you do this, you know? And he was generally right. Once in a while he was wrong. We'd say, no, Sheldon. We'd argue with him.
You needed that combination of somebody to write like that and somebody to say, no, that's no good. Give that line to her and let him say that, you know, things like that. So that worked out very well also with Sheldon and Carl.
You could tell how it was going by Sheldon's breathing. He would start off. If the show wasn't working, he would be doing.
The meeting ended with Sheldon Leonard, the boss, saying, I gotta go to a meeting. All right, Carl, go ahead. I don't get it, but go ahead.
We had different ideas about the Dick Van Dyke Show. And he would say, you do it. He would get angry and he'd say, you do it.
and he would make his comments succinctly, and as we would be all talking and, you know, discussing what to do and what Sheldon had said and what Carl had said, suddenly Sheldon would disappear. He would just be gone, and nobody on the set ever saw him leave.
You would see him get up and go to the coffee and come back and sit down. He might do that twice, and on the third time he'd disappear.
Sheldon was Sheldon, you know. He is the most generous, the most inventive, the most honest, the most decent, both as a person and as a writer.
He was, to me, father, brother, confessor. He was just about everything. He was not a lover, Estelle.
Carl was the brains behind everything. His mind is brilliant for comedy.
Wonderful man. To this day, he's probably my favorite human being that I've ever known.
It was actually 2 takes that fast, maybe 4 minutes, and that became the signature of the show.
I wish I could remember how that came about. I think probably we were clowning on the set one day, and I did some kind of a fall, and he decided to incorporate it.
And Dick comes in and he says, hello, everybody. He walks over, falls down. They all cluster around and pick him up. I said, print. That's it. We did it. Carl said, let's do a variation. He's very clever, you know. He said, let's do one where he misses the stool. Then we'll change it week by week.
Their name was Petrie, Rob Petrie. In the pilot, I said Petrie. And Carl said, well, okay, it's Petrie.
There were some O-Robs that were definitely written in, but I don't think any of us knew how they would grow. I mean, literally swell in different directions. That one would be oh, Rob, or you know, then the next one would be, oh, Rob, and you know, then the classic one, oh, Rob. I think it was the last show that we did where everybody played cowboys, and I was allowed to sing and dance.
Where Did I Come From?, in which Dick recounts how the baby was born, and it was hilarious.
The delicatessen man who was in love with me and who I couldn't see for anything, and was embarrassing because he was so sweet and so nice, and I couldn't be bothered with him.
Anything that had a lot of shtick in it, of course, I loved. The one with where we're telling about the day the baby was born. Richie says, where did I come from? And I say, Cleveland. He said, no, I mean, where did I really come from? And we do a flashback about the days preceding his birth. We did one, I think that our babies have been mixed up in the hospital.
And it turns out that the other couple, their name is Petrie, and the other couple is named Peters. And Laura was in room 103, and they're in room 108. They kept getting the wrong, you close up a 3, it becomes an 8, and she had the rice pudding, and we got the wrong flowers, and you know, all these things were saying, I got the wrong baby.
The only thing we didn't have at the point was an ending, since there was no DNA, that was irrevocably the answer that Dick was wrong and that it was their baby.
So he calls up the Peters and he says, you got something of, well, we got something of yours too. You know, and he's convinced they're going to change babies. Come on over, okay, you can bring it.
I'd say we all came up with the idea that it had to be that the other family were black.
Well, the network didn't like that at all.
God bless Carl and Sheldon. They said, look, we'll do the show, and if the audience tells us it's bad taste, we'll pay for it. If the audience accepts it, you pay for it.
When the door opened and Dick saw who it was and the audience saw, there was a silence. Enough time for Carl to say, oh shit, to me, because it looked like, and then...
The audience exploded in that theater, in that stage, and they didn't stop laughing, and I think Sheldon and Carl have said that it's the longest single laugh ever on that series.
The line that saved it was as follows. Dick said to Greg later, he said, why didn't you tell us before that you were black? He didn't have to say, why didn't you tell us before? You know, we didn't use the word. And he said, what, I missed the expression on your face?
Greg Morris was more intelligent, more reserved, and in other ways compared very favorably to Dick, who was convinced that his babies had gotten mixed up in the hospital.
It was beyond daring in 1963 to do that.
You know, the first day, Carl said 5 years is it. If we go 5 years, that's all.
They could have gone on for another 5 years, but they all decided, Carl, Mary, and Dick decided that they wanted to go out when people wanted more.
We had already done almost every premise that we knew of, and we sometimes started eating off ourselves, doing something like the premise we did before. Although the last year, some of our best shows.
Mary and Dick were being seduced by picture makers, by the major studios.
I think Carl wanted to move on and do some movies, which he did. And I think Mary wanted to also do some other things. But most of us would have stayed. That wasn't coming to work. That was coming to play.
It was devastating to me because while I, too, wanted to succeed and I wanted to go on, and I had been offered Breakfast at Tiffany's on Broadway, it was the end of a family.
I was disappointed. I thought it was a big mistake. I thought that they could have written, if it was just money they wanted, they were at the point where they could have written their own ticket.
I thought another 2 years would do fine. In color. Just the fact that we were in color would be great.
None of us really wanted to quit. I've often been blamed for taking the show off the air. I had nothing to do with it.
The only thing that looks old about that show is the fact that it's in black and white and the clothing.
The Van Dyke Show reflected the time that it was in by opening the doors to the time where it was going.
There was a realness to it, you know, that was reflected in the way my mother and father were with each other, and they, it was just an honest look at how married couples really were.
The relationship between the husband and wife and the writers, it was very, very real. Everything that came out as funny came out of the reality.
We were one of the first shows that had real emotions and some truth-telling, revealing of character flaws.
It absolutely deserves all the attention it gets as one of the milestones of great television.
There's only twice in my life I can say when I was doing something, this is good. That was the Carl show and the Disney movie Mary Poppins. When I was doing it, I said, this is good.